In today's video, we're looking at the 4060 Ti 16GB versus the RX 7800 XT. Now, why are we looking at these two graphics cards? Let's pause for a second and take a look at their pricing. So if I wanted to buy a 4060 Ti 16GB right now new, I'd be paying $450. That's good news compared to its launch price, which was originally $500. But the problem is that that puts it up against some stiff competition. AMD's 7800 XT does cost a little bit more, but we're talking $30 more when you're already spending $450 to get up to $480 again if we're comparing the lowest price models of both GPUs. So in other words, you're paying 7% more money if you look at it that way, as $480 versus $450. Both of them are 16GB graphics cards. One of them's Nvidia, one of them's AMD. Kind of interesting. Some people might be like, well, the 4060 Ti should be compared against the 7700 XT. The thing is that when the 7700 XT launched at $450, I would have agreed with you, but now its price has dropped down as low as $380. The 7700 XT is in pricing competition with the 8GB 4060 Ti, which is priced very, very similarly. But notice that the price of the 7800 XT is actually closer to the price of the 4060 Ti 16GB than the 7700 XT is. And some people might be like, the 7800 XT should be compared with the 4070. Well, yeah, I've already compared it with that, but actually the 4070 at current pricing as low as $530. There's a $50 price gap between the 7800 XT and the 4070, and a $30 price gap between the 7800 XT and the 4060 Ti 16GB. So actually, these two cards are the closest price competitors between the two brands in the new GPU market. And they're interesting in that they are both 16GB graphics cards, but what does the overall performance level get you? The first game I tested out was Ghost of Tsushima, and at 1440p very high settings, the 4060 Ti 16GB can average about 58 FPS. I'll go ahead and fly down to the tiny little, here, pop out if you need me. But the 7800 XT can do 95 FPS, which is a 64% lead, better than we'll see in most of the testing. If we kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, both GPUs increase in performance, but the 4060 Ti is reaching 85 FPS, whereas the 7800 XT is hitting 125, which is a 47% lead, although I would give the image quality edge to DLSS over FSR in this game. By the way, I know FSR 3.1 came out yesterday, but this testing was done about 2 or 3 days ago, so missed that slightly. However, take a look at this. What am I actually comparing here? Let's pause for a second, because these are not apples to apples comparisons here. That's why I took away the relative performance chart. We can still see some performance numbers up here. What am I looking at? So the big argument for a lot of people in gaming performance is that you'd pay more for Nvidia because DLSS is so much better than FSR. Now, here's the thing though. When the performance gap is large enough, the 7800 XT, without any upscaling at all, is outperforming the 4060 Ti 16GB when it is using DLSS quality. So even if you thought the DLSS quality was basically as good as native, which is not usually the case, although you can find specific circumstances where that can be the case, generally DLSS quality will look a bit worse than native, so running native faster than running DLSS quality is a pretty big deal. Here we're seeing 96 FPS versus 86, running this same scene, again, at native resolution for the 7800 XT versus using DLSS quality on the 4060 Ti 16GB. So I definitely do see that DLSS can be a big selling point for NVIDIA GPUs, but when the performance gap is this large, it just doesn't even get you to the native performance of the competing product. Here we also have DLSS 3 versus FSR 3 frame generation. And notice that, again, they're not going to produce exactly the same frame pacing or image quality, but you're definitely getting more total frames out of the 7800 XT here, getting a 61% faster average FPS and 65% higher in the 1% lows. not really needed frame generation in this game since they already had a pretty high frame rate. If we drop down to 1080p at very high settings, we see that the 4060 Ti is delivering 84 frames per second, and the 7800 XT is delivering 125, giving it a 49% advantage. And the 1% lows are also a 49% advantage at 109 versus 73. So again, both GPUs are doing well here, but the 7800 XT is taking a pretty commanding lead. Let's test out some more games. How about Horizon Forbidden West? Well, at 1440p, very high settings, the 4060 Ti is good for 61 FPS. Perfectly acceptable experience, but the 7800 XT is delivering 86 frames per second, giving it a 41% advantage. In the 1% lows, we see an even larger 47% lead for the 7800 XT at 75 versus 51. If we kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, again, I would say that DLSS has an image quality advantage here, so this is not an apples-to-apples comparison. And the 4060 Ti does close a bit of the performance gap as well, but the 7800 XT is still taking a 30% lead at 104 versus 80, and the 1% lows at 68 versus 86, giving it a 26% lead in the 1% lows. But once again, I can look at this comparison, which is, okay, if let's say you're going to use DLSS with the 4060 Ti and you're going to run native resolution on the 7800 XT, once again, if you look at the performance, the native resolution on the 7800 XT is actually running faster than using upscaling at the quality setting on the 4060 Ti 16GB. So that kind of nullifies what's, in my opinion, the biggest advantage for Nvidia over AMD in most gaming situations, which is that DLSS advantage. If we go down to 1080p, both GPUs are doing well at very high settings. The 4060 Ti is at 83 FPS, good experience, but the 7800 XT is delivering 110 frames per second, giving it a 33% lead in the averages and a 29% lead in the 1% lows at 89 versus 69. If we move into the latest and greatest Unreal Engine 5 showcase title, we have Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga at 1440p high settings. High is the highest setting in the game. The 7800 XT is just falling slightly short of a 60 FPS experience, which is honestly good enough here at 56 FPS. This game's pretty slow paced, but the 4060 Ti is delivering 39 FPS, giving the 7800 XT a 44% lead in the averages and a 53% lead in the 1% lows. Unreal Engine 5 can get a massive performance boost using upscaling. So if we do that here, using DLSS at the quality setting gets the 4060 Ti to 57 FPS average, and the 7800 XT, if using FSR quality, gets to 81 FPS average, giving it a 42% advantage, although once again, we're now no longer in an apples-to-apples comparison. And now notice, once again, that while this time with no upscaling on our 7800 XT versus using DLSS quality on our 4060 Ti 16GB, the performance numbers are basically a tie. So this time the 7800 XT isn't winning versus the upscaled DLSS quality setting, but it is at least matching the performance and doing it without needing upscaling. If we go down to medium settings at 1440p, we see that the 7800 XT is good for 76 FPS average, and the 4060 Ti is delivering 53 FPS average. So both are very playable here, but the 7800 XT takes a 43% advantage and a 52% lead in the 1% lows at 67 versus 44. Now, if we go ahead and change things up again by kicking on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, but this time using the medium graphics preset as the baseline, both GPUs are performing well, but the 7800 XT is taking a 43% lead at 107 FPS versus 75, and the 1% lows at 58% lead at 93 FPS versus 59. Again, a pretty big lead there for the 7800 XT. If we drop down to 1080p resolution, at the high preset, the 4060 Ti is actually a little bit short of a 60 FPS experience. Honestly, still probably enough frames to enjoy the game maxed out at 1080p at 55, but the 7800 XT gives you a much smoother experience at 76 frames per second versus the 55 on the 4060 Ti, giving it a 38% advantage and a 40% lead in the 1% lows at 66 versus 47. If we drop down to the medium settings at 1080p, the 4060 Ti can now finally comfortably break 60 frames per second here, averaging 73. Whereas the 7800 XT is now breaking 100 FPS at 101, giving it a 38% advantage in the averages and a 44% advantage in the 1% lows at 88 versus 61. So the 7800 XT definitely leading there in Unreal Engine 5. So what about ray tracing? So if we take a look at ray tracing in Avatar, at the Ultra preset, the 7800 XT has a less dominant win because Nvidia does generally have better ray tracing performance. But the 7800 XT's raw performance is such a lead that while the 4060 Ti closes some of the gap, it's still behind, the 7800 XT taking an 18% advantage there. However, neither one was breaking 60 FPS until we use upscaling. So if we kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting off the 1440p Ultra baseline, the 7800 XT's lead drops to 8% and 2% in the 1% lows. So this is a much closer race in frame rate. And I will say that DLSS looks a little better image quality-wise, especially if you look at like the fence lines and things like that. So I would, toss this as maybe a better experience due to the DLSS image quality advantage there for the 4060 Ti, and performance was pretty similar. You could also, instead of upscaling, drop the resolution down to 1440p. Sorry, not the resolution, but the settings down to 1440p high. And that gives us a 9% performance lead for the 7800 XT and 2% in the 1% lows. So the 7800 XT is again taking a small lead in a ray tracing experience here in Avatar at 1440p high. If you want to get a higher refresh rate experience to play a first-person shooter style game, you might want to also kick on DLSS and FSR at the quality setting off of that high baseline. And now the GPUs are honestly so close, I'd call it a tie. The 7800 XT is still slightly ahead in the averages at 83 versus 80. And slightly behind in the 1% lows at 60 versus 61. And again, the DLSS would have a bit of an image quality edge here. So maybe a bit of a win there for the 4060 Ti. Now, if we drop down to 1080p resolution, again, Ultra settings does include ray tracing. The 7800 XT is 10% ahead in the averages and tied in the 1% lows at 48. The 7800 XT is at 64 FPS average versus 58 on our 4060 Ti. So both of them right around that 60 FPS mark, offering you a decent experience. But if you wanted a higher refresh rate experience for playing a first-person shooter on a mouse kind of setup, if you drop down to the high settings at 1080p, we see the 7800 XT taking a 5% advantage. So pretty close performance here, 80 versus 76, and the 1% lows are actually tied at 59. So again, with ray tracing, our 4060 Ti was putting up a much better show, but the 7800 XT was often still ahead in the performance. However, if you really crank up the ray tracing settings, you try to do something like RT Overdrive mode in Cyberpunk at 1440p, well, honestly, you have to upscale so much it might not be worth it. We're looking at performance mode upscaling at 1440p, which is only a 720p internal resolution. But the 4060 Ti does take a 35% lead here, hitting 50 FPS, so it is more usable, although again, it's a lot of upscaling to get there. Not sure it's how I'd want to play the game. So if you reduce the ray tracing to just using RT reflections off of the Ultra preset baseline, not RT Ultra, and then use quality level upscaling, you're getting a much higher frame rate without sacrificing so much to the upscaling. And now the 7800 XT is actually slightly ahead by 5% and 7% in the 1% lows and averaging 80 versus 76 FPS. Now, if you just go ahead and turn off ray tracing and turn off upscaling, the 7800 XT has a crushing victory here by 65% at 94 FPS versus 57, and the 1% lows are leading by 72% at 74 versus 43. So if you do want to just play the game at Ultra without ray tracing on, the 7800 XT is definitely offering the better experience there. Now, if we drop down to 1080p resolution and run through similar testing, RT Overdrive mode, if you use quality level upscaling, which I don't love to do at 1080p, although if I was going to do it, DLSS does do a better job. The 4060 Ti is able to hit a 52 FPS average. It's usable, might not be the kind of frame rates you're chasing, maybe kick on frame generation, but it's taking a 37% lead. However, if we kick on RT reflections instead of the RT overdrive mode and just use RT reflections on top of ultra settings with no upscaling, which is how, I definitely would prefer not to upscale at 1080p. Now we're getting a 7% lead for the 7800 XT at 76 FPS versus 71, and a 3% lead in the 1% lows at 60 versus 58. So pretty close performance there at those settings, but a bit of a lead for AMD despite it being ray tracing. And if you turn the ray tracing all the way off, you see that the 7800 XT takes a 45% lead at 141 FPS versus 97 FPS, and the 1% lows are taking a 39% lead at 106 versus 76. So again, in Cyberpunk, when you're not using ray tracing, the AMD GPU is pulling very far ahead. Now, another game where we could look at really cranking the ray tracing settings is Alan Wake 2. But if you try to kick on the RT high settings on top of the high non-ray traced settings, even going down to DLSS and FSR at the balanced setting, which is pretty aggressive for 1440p, but you might find it usable, the 4060 Ti is only hitting 34 FPS and 27 in the 1% lows. It is crushing the 7800 XT by 54% in the averages, but it's not a great experience on either GPU. If we move on to just the high settings without any upscaling, this game forces you to use either DLSS or FSR native resolution as like an anti-aliasing technique. But anyway, if you turn the ray tracing off, now the 7800 XT is taking a pretty dominant 44% lead in the averages at 59 versus 41. And the 1% lows are a 25% lead at 40 versus 32. To get to beat 60 FPS on the 4060 Ti, you're going to have to use quality level upscaling, which honestly still looks pretty good here off of the high preset. And the 4060 Ti is able to hit 64 FPS. The 7800 XT hits 94 FPS with quality level upscaling, although, again, the image quality advantage would go to the DLSS here. But it is a 47% performance advantage, and again, you could just turn the upscaling off on the 7800 XT and have similar performance to the upscaling on the 4060 Ti. If we drop down to 1080p and try to use the ray tracing at the high settings, you have to use DLSS Quality to even get a reasonably playable experience on the 4060 Ti. It's a 63% lead, but you're only hitting 44 FPS total. And again, that is using upscaling at 1080p, which would be better to avoid if possible, in my opinion. So if you want to play at native 1080p resolution, probably drop down to the high settings without any ray tracing, and now the 4060 Ti is able to hit 60 frames per second. But the 7800 XT is able to hit 87, giving it a 45% advantage, and the 1% lows are 26% advantage for AMD at 58 versus 46. So that wraps up Alan Wake 2. What about some other games? Again, not every game has the super heavy ray tracing workload. Some games like Resident Evil 4 offer a little bit of ray trace reflections at the max settings, and it doesn't take a massive performance hit to enable it, and so the 7800 XT is still able to lead here by 38%, despite this being a light ray tracing workload. At 102 FPS versus 74, both are actually very, very playable here. If you go down to the prioritized graphics preset, which does not have ray tracing, the 7800 XT's lead grows to 52% at 146 versus 96. So again, both GPUs give you a very good experience here, but it is a significant advantage for the 7800 XT. In the 1% lows, you also have a large advantage by 52% at 132 FPS versus 87. If we drop down to 1080p resolution, again, going back up to the max settings, which again includes some ray tracing, here we see the 7800 XT hitting 127 frames per second and the 4060 Ti at 101. That gives a 26% lead for the 7800 XT. And a 22% lead in the 1% lows at 111 versus 91. So again, in the light ray tracing workloads, the AMD GPU tends to stay ahead because it would have been further ahead with ray tracing turned off, which is what we see here. If we go down to the prioritized graphics preset, where there's no ray tracing enabled, we see the 7800 XT increase its lead to 37% at 196 versus 143. And the 1% lows are a 35% advantage at 176 versus 130. So let's go ahead and check out a couple more games. So not every game uses ray tracing. If we look at something like Starfield, there's no ray tracing on offer. At 1440p ultra settings, the 7800 XT can comfortably average over 60 FPS, hitting 65, whereas the 4060 Ti is down at 49. The 1% lows are 53 versus 36. So we're getting a 33% lead in the averages for AMD here and a 47% lead in the 1% lows. So if you did want to kick on upscaling to get the 4060 Ti over 60 FPS, it can get to 61 FPS using DLSS Quality. If you let the 7800 XT use FSR Quality, it hits 78 FPS, giving it a 28% lead over the 4060 Ti, and a 33% lead in the 1% lows at 60 versus 45. But once again, notice that if you didn't want to use FSR on the 7800 XT, you could have left it at native settings and it still would have been beating the 4060 Ti when using DLSS. If we drop down to 1080p Ultra, the 4060 Ti is able to break 60 FPS at 61, whereas the 7800 XT is 30% faster, hitting 79 frames per second. In the 1% lows, we're seeing a 41% advantage for the AMD GPU at 62 versus 44 on the 4060 Ti. So again, we can try out another game with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. I tested at the basic preset because that's turning graphic settings down to chase high frame rates, which I think most people do in competitive multiplayer games. That gives the 7800 XT 231 frames per second, and the 4060 Ti puts up a respectable 156, but that is a 48% lead for the 7800 XT and a 60% lead in the 1% lows. If we drop down to 1080p resolution, the 7800 XT can stretch its legs out to 295 frames per second, and the 4060 Ti is delivering a very healthy 220, but that is a 34% advantage for the 7800 XT, and the 1% lows are a 40% advantage for the 7800 XT at 202 versus 144. So, let's go ahead and pop out for some final thoughts on this matchup. So really, this shows kind of the problem with the 4060 Ti 16GB. It's not that it can't give you a good experience in the latest games, and the 16GB VRAM buffer is certainly nice to have. But the problem is its pricing. If the 4060 Ti 16GB version costs $450, then again, like I said, as we're showing in this video, that means it's just not that much more money to buy a 7800 XT, right? It is 7% more money to get how much more performance? Well, usually 40% or more performance increase for that extra 7%. Now, sometimes you're down at like a 30% or so lead, but in some games, we even saw the lead grow over 60%, especially when we're at 1440p. Now, Nvidia does have some advantages, but the interesting thing is, well, DLSS tends to be, in my opinion, one of the biggest advantages for Nvidia in gaming compared to AMD. Well, using DLSS Quality is frequently still behind using no upscaling at all and getting to play at native resolution on the 7800 XT because there's such a wide performance gap between the GPUs. And this did not just happen in one game, this happened in multiple games. And then in other games where I didn't even bother showing the side-by-side, it was still the case. Because it just felt like it would be kind of repetitive over and over again to point it out. And then the other big advantage for Nvidia tends to be ray tracing. However, as we saw, in light to medium ray tracing workloads, the 7800 XT has such an overall just raw power advantage over the 4060 Ti that while the 4060 Ti closes some of its usual gap when you're looking at rasterized performance, the 7800 XT is often still ahead when using ray tracing. Now, there are the heaviest ray tracing workloads, stuff like Alan Wake 2, 1440p RT high, but even going all the way down to DLSS balanced, The 4060 Ti is barely breaking 30 frames per second here, and its 1% lows are dropping below 30 frames per second, meaning you can't even lock to 30 frames per second smoothly on the 4060 Ti at these settings. And again, it's already going all the way down to balanced mode on DLSS. So these extremely heavy ray tracing workloads, which do give the 4060 Ti a very healthy advantage over the 7800 XT, are just not a particularly usable experience. But let's say you wanted to use them. The other thing I want to point out is that even if it gets you a 50% advantage in these extreme ray tracing situations, notice that it's not uncommon for the AMD GPU to be taking a 40 to 50% advantage over the 4060 Ti in much more common situations, because those really heavy path tracing games tend to be a every once in a while sponsorship event from Nvidia, rather than most AAA game development is more designed around the gaming consoles, which don't offer that level of ray tracing. They tend to either be using like the Lumen kind of situation in Unreal Engine 5, or using something more like what we're seeing in Avatar, for example. Avatar does use, for consoles, a pretty good ray tracing setup. It's not extremely lightweight, and it does quite a lot for the graphics, but again, the 7800 XT is able to handle that when it's not in that path tracing mode. So I've really got to say that this matchup seems, in my opinion, to be a bit of a bloodbath. The usual reasons to buy the Nvidia GPU are the upscaling and ray tracing advantages, but the performance difference is so large here that it's kind of nullifying both of those. Which means that yes, it does cost an extra $30, but if you've got it in your budget, the 7800 XT makes a lot more sense than the 4060 Ti 16GB. Now, again, I think the 4070 and especially the 4070 Super put up much stronger fights against the 7800 XT, but they cost a lot more. Again, why was I comparing the 7800 XT with the 4060 Ti 16GB? Because it's actually the closest priced in the current market competitor from Nvidia and AMD. They're closer in price than the 7800 XT and the 4070. I know I'll see it in the comment section that I shouldn't be comparing these two, but they're closer in price. So anyway, there's the comparison if you found it interesting. Got lots of other head-to-head matchups on the channel. Hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Definitely if I was right at that like top end of my price range at $450, I would really look at if you could stretch it up to get that 7800 XT. Last thing I'll mention though is the 4060 Ti 16GB. I think where it really makes sense is for people who need Nvidia for some sort of productivity workload other than gaming. Like maybe if you're trying to do certain things with, like, I'm not an expert on these, that's why I don't test them out. I focus on gaming, but I've heard that, things like Blender and various AI models and things like that are just programmed better for support for Nvidia, in which case having 16 gigabytes of VRAM for those without having to buy something like a 4070 Ti Super or 4080 can make it interesting for those types of use cases. But in this video, we're looking at gaming setups. And for gaming, like I said, the big NVIDIA advantages were DLSS and ray tracing, but the performance lead for the 7800 XT was so much that it even pulls ahead in those situations as well. So, yeah, like I said, hope you guys have an excellent day.